For 8 days in June, the University of Victoria played host to Congress 2013 of the Humanities and Social Sciences. Over 7,000 delegates from across the country and around the world enjoyed dynamic presentations as well as cultural and social events. The Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, or PICS, was pleased to take part in this Festival of Arts and Ideas. A panel discussion on the benefits of a carbon tax was led by the PICS team and is presented for you now.
Hello, my name is Tom Peterson. I'm the Executive Director of the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions based at the University of Victoria. We're a 4-university consortium that comprises the University of British Columbia, Simon Fraser University, University of Northern British Columbia in Prince George, and the University of Victoria here in this town. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this presentation of the Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Victoria in June of 2013. The session was entitled The Benefits of Carbon Taxation. And as many of you will know if you're watching today, British Columbia took great leadership in 2008 by bringing into play North America's first broad-spectrum legislated carbon tax that has actually started to deliver some very interesting results that you're going to hear about in this video. We have a panel today that is going to discuss this very important issue from a number of different perspectives. I will first present a little bit of climate science to offer the context as to why putting a price on carbon is so important for the future of humanity. I will be followed by James Mack, the head of the Climate Action Secretariat of the Ministry of Environment of the Government of British Columbia, and he will offer a little bit of the political history as to how we got to where we are today. James will be followed by Professor Stuart Elgee, who is a professor of law and economics at the University of Ottawa, and the founder of Canada's best-known green think tank called Sustainable Prosperity at the University of Ottawa. And Stuart will look at the data to show what the impact of British Columbia's carbon tax since July of 2008 has been on fuel consumption here in the province of BC. And finally, Katja Rhodes, a PhD student at Simon Fraser University and a Vanier Fellowship holder, will discuss what the political perception of the carbon tax is and has been in recent years. I hope you enjoy the program. I think you'll find it of great interest. We do tend to cover or try to cover all of the different aspects that have to do with carbon tax imposition. And away we go. Most of you in this room will have seen this before in one way or another. At least I hope you've seen it. This is the very famous Keeling curve. It's perhaps the most iconic image now in the earth sciences on this planet. And when I was a young man, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere was sitting down here at about 305 parts per million. Now I'm a baby boomer, so you're looking at a change on this graph from the 1950s through to today, which is absolutely extraordinary. We've gone from something on the order of 300 parts per million carbon dioxide to about 400 parts per million carbon dioxide in one human generation. Mother Nature has never changed the concentration of such an important constituent of our atmosphere this fast, as far as we know, in the entire history of planet Earth. We are changing the composition of the atmosphere faster than has ever been accomplished in nature, and this rate of change is something that we have to get a good handle on. On May 9th, for the first time in essentially history, we broke through the 400 parts per million barrier, at least the first time in the last million years or so. Now that was only for one day. That was the daily average. We went just above 400 parts per million. It's coming back down a bit now, because as you can see, there's a seasonal cycle in here. And in the summertime, when plants start to bloom and blossom and all the trees burst into life, like here in Victoria, they're taking carbon dioxide out of the air. So right now, the concentration is going to come down by a couple of parts per million. It'll go back up again next winter. And then next summer, we'll be in the 401, 402 part per million range. 400 ppm is just a symbolic threshold. It doesn't mean an awful lot, except that we're continuing on this very steep pathway toward an uncertain future. And the effect of that is that we are retaining more heat on this planet. Carbon dioxide is an effective gas for intercepting infrared radiation. That's the radiation that leaps off you at hot pavement in the summertime when you're looking down at black pavement. You can feel the heat on your face.
And normally that radiation would escape to space, and the Earth would be in balance. Sun comes in, infrared goes out. What we've done is upset that balance. We put so much CO2 into the atmosphere now that we're intercepting more of that infrared radiation. And the result is that the planet is warming up, and the evidence for that is all around us. You don't have to look very far. I'm going to show you this graph, or I am showing you this graph because I love this graph. This is a thing of beauty. This is a Portuguese team that published this in the journal Science in 2011. What you see here are 511 vertical lines. Each one represents the average June, July, August summertime temperature in Europe as estimated from thermometer records, or if you go back deeper in time, before thermometers were invented, from things like tree rings. When you look at 511 years of history and distribute those across the graph in terms of their departure from the average, you see that there's a bunch of cold summers and a bunch of warm summers. And so you ask yourself, when was the last really cold summer in Europe? Well, there it is, 1923. And then you flip the coin over and you say, when was the last really warm summer in Europe? Well, take your pick. 2007, 2006, 2002, 2003, 2010. The 5 warmest summers in recorded human history in Europe have all happened since 2002. And this one in particular, 2010, was an extraordinary departure from the mean. You know, this is sitting almost 4 standard deviations away from the average. Now, in statistical terms, that's enormous. That's like hitting a home run, not just out of the ballpark, but across the river, across the next county, and halfway across the next state. That's how far from human experience that temperature was. What it did, well, it sat for 62 straight days as a high-pressure system over Moscow, afflicted most of Europe and into central Russia, set temperature records 62 straight days in a row, and those temperatures were way above normal, 7, maybe as much as 8 degrees Celsius above normal. It caused 11,000 excess deaths in Moscow alone. This is just one city. In July and August of 2010, they had 11,000 deaths beyond what the normal actuarial mortality rate would be. Absolutely stunning impact on human society. A lot of those deaths were attributed to lung problems, people that were already compromised medically. The air was filled with smoke, and it was filled with smoke because many of the forests in western Russia caught fire, either from lightning or other sources, other charges. This is a map of carbon monoxide, which is a product of incomplete combustion of biomass, and that extended all the way down into central China and right across into northern Africa. An immense geographical footprint from that particular event. But it also affected us here. And these things now, these extreme weather events, which we can now physically tie to long-term climate change, they're having an impact that is absolutely global in extent. That Russian heat wave, which took place here from July through August of 2010, drove the world price of wheat from about $180 a ton up to about $270 a ton in less than a month and a half. Now that's because the wheat just withered on the stalks in the Ukraine and Russia. And on July 31st of 2010, Russia closed its borders to wheat export. Now Russia only supplies 4% of the world's export market for wheat. But the market internationally is so carefully balanced now that even a closure of exports on the scale of 4% was enough to let the speculators start scrambling to buy wheat futures, enough to let rich countries start to fill their warehouses with wheat because they feared the future. And the price took a sudden jump upward. Well, it got worse. It was $354 by May of 2011. And as of 4 days ago, it was at $320. The price has remained high. And the impact of that, which I'm going to tie back to carbon dioxide in a while, the impact of that has been profound for humanity. If we look at the World Commodity Food Price Index that the United Nations puts out regularly, and go back to the early 1990s, you can see that the price of food in terms of basic commodities didn't change an awful lot until the mid-2000s. Then along came George W. Bush, who was following on from Bill Clinton, and he put in place a noble policy in the United States, the Energy Security and Independence Act, which was a requirement to produce ethanol from corn. And so now 40% of American corn production goes directly into producing fuel for automobiles instead of food for human beings. That single act caused the price of corn to shoot through the roof in 2006, 2007, 2008. And it came back out after that as the market adjusted to it. So that was the ethanol peak, and that had global repercussions. And then along came the extreme weather events of 2010. Russia baked, Pakistan flooded, Queensland got hit by a major cyclone, which was exacerbated by the warmest temperatures ever measured in the Coral Sea, immediately to the east of Queensland. The United States got soaked up in the northern states, particularly the Dakotas, along with Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Our wheat production was down 22% in 2010 because of the very wet spring we had, record rainfall in April and May in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. The combination of those events shot the price of food back up, and it hasn't really come down since. Well, so what, you might say? Well, here's the so what. When the price of food goes through the roof like that, if you're in a poor country, or you're a father trying to provide for your family, or a mother trying to provide for your family, and you are pretty thin in the wallet, you end up protesting. And the price of food is now reckoned to be one of the many factors that helped to bring down Hosni Mubarak in Egypt and many of the other administrations across the Middle East. They had bread riots in Cairo, and they're so-called bread riots because they took baguettes as they were marching. You can see the baguettes here as they were marching down the street. This image comes from a wonderful publication that came out in February called The Arab Spring and Climate Change. You can download it on the web, and I highly recommend it. It's a collection of 6 essays by experts who look very carefully at the link between changing climate and social unrest and revolution in the Middle East. And here's another piece of information. This arrived on my computer about 6 days ago, and I find it staggering. There's the same food price index that you've just seen, only this time it stops here just before 2012. The red lines are riots in various parts of the world, primarily Middle East and Africa, but they also include Haiti in here and one in India. And look at the correlation. This is pretty staggering. Now keep in mind that extreme weather events, which we can now physically tie to long-term climate change on planet Earth, are fundamentally responsible, along with other factors like population growth and China consuming more meat and so on, in pushing up the price of food. But climate change has a big role to play in this whole picture. And so here's our challenge as a human society. We have to slow the rate of rise, because right now things are happening so quickly that we're having great difficulty in adjusting. We need to slow that rate of rise, and we need to do it substantially. And economists, and we've got 3 of them sitting here at the table, tell us there's only one way to do that. That's to put a price on what we don't want. And we don't want more carbon emissions. So we need to bend that curve. We need to start yesterday in bending that curve. Well, BC did start yesterday. In fact, we started in 2008. We took a leadership position that was politically extraordinarily bold. And the panel of today is going to look at that history, and James is going to lead off on that very soon, and then what the tax has done since. So that's the context in which we are holding this discussion today. We need, as a human society, to respond to this absolutely compelling imperative in front of us. And James is now going to discuss for you the political history that got us to this position.
The important one is actually the 80% reduction by 2050. There's a long-term goal to get off fossil fuels. There was a Climate Action Plan, which is the first document in the top left, which as a foundation element has a price on carbon. So the revenue neutral carbon tax It has other policy elements. It is, as I said, a whole of government approach. We're the first carbon neutral government in North America. 182 out of our 188 local governments have signed a climate action charter committing them to reducing emissions and becoming carbon neutral for their operations. We have an adaptation strategy which mainstreams understanding the impacts of climate change and how we do everything from our reforestation policies, water management, infrastructure investments. And we have actions in every sector. So every single ministry in government has an element of climate change incorporated in their business, and you'll see it in every face of the BC economy. What's interesting as well is 2 years ago, the government issued our BC Jobs Plan. And in that document, in our jobs plan, it says BC is and will remain a climate change leader. Now, granted, it's the doing that's hard, but it's interesting, and I would say not unique, because other jurisdictions are doing it as well, but still interesting that governments are viewing climate change as part of their jobs and economic agenda. And it's a trend that we hope to see continue. Really quickly, this is our greenhouse gas emissions profile in BC. These look at the human-sourced emissions at 62 million tons every year. And what's important here when you, which is more what I say to international audiences, electricity generation is a very small part of BC's emissions. And I mostly just put this up to caution those people thinking of carbon taxes. If you're a coal-fired electricity jurisdiction, you're going to have a much different impact at $10 or $30 a ton than we do. It also means for BC that our heavy use of hydroelectricity and renewables is a huge advantage for us. That as we shift from, as we fuel switch from high energy to low carbon electricity, we have some potential wins from a greenhouse gas profile. And not to shy away from it, a large part of our emissions, if you look at our industry section and fossil fuel production, come from our heavy industry sector as well as commercial transportation. So there's a suite of challenges everywhere, from how do you deal with industries, how do you deal with the land base, and how do you deal with families and communities across BC. So our cornerstone policy is the revenue neutral carbon tax, and it's a cornerstone for two reasons. One is it really is the signature piece of our climate agenda. In 2008, the view was if you were serious about taking action on climate change, you needed a clear, transparent price on carbon. And this was something that BC could do on its own. So we implemented in 2008 a price of $10 per ton on carbon, the equivalent of carbon dioxide. And that's gone up each year up until July 1st, 2012, where it reached $30 a ton. It applies to the combustion of fossil fuels, and there are no exemptions to the carbon tax. And I'm sure we can get into, but it's practically no exemptions. We can get into some details on the ins and outs on that. And so this is, again, when people visit BC to learn about our climate policies, this is what they come for. What's interesting is when we go out of BC to talk to people, what they're really interested in is that it's a cornerstone tax policy. So we generate $1.2 billion in revenue from this tax on pollution, and that is returned back into the economy through corresponding tax breaks. In particular, low personal income taxes and low corporate taxes. And that's also part of the government's objectives, is that tax reform message. And that's, interestingly enough, one of the unifying themes that we've seen from governments is struggling with how to do good tax policy. And there's probably as many people interested in the carbon tax for its climate policy benefits as there are those who are interested in it as a tax shift. And this chart just gives you a quick sense. Although the carbon tax doesn't apply to every source of emissions in BC, it's hitting around 68%. You'll see issues like deforestation, or in industrial non-combustion, you can see some of the chemical processes that happen with cement or smelting. Importantly, our oil and gas sector, there's the venting of emissions, which don't involve combustion. So in 2008, it was a simple tool that we could introduce to deal with the vast majority of our emissions, but it's not to say that there's not other areas that we need to deal with and develop other tools to get there. On the tax policy side, this explains to you basically how that breakdown happens. So the carbon tax revenues in 13-14 bring in 1.24 billion. And really what you're seeing there is we have one of the lowest corporate tax rates in the OECD. We have, for those making less than $120,000 a year, the lowest personal income tax rates in Canada, and targeted measures to deal with low-income families, rural and northern homeowners, and then assortment of smaller measures. So this is really a message around those types of areas that we want people to do less of, like pollution that creates common harms to British Columbia and the world, and incentivizing the things that we like, getting a job, starting a business, creating economic growth. Quick note on implementation is that the other merit of the carbon tax was that it was quick. So in terms of trying to make real results and make a difference and send that signal to other jurisdictions of where we wanted to move, we announced the carbon tax in the budget of early 2008, and it was in place on July 1st of that year. Granted, I think the people in the finance ministry would probably say that's a lot of work to achieve in a few months, but if you look at the history of implementation for climate policy measures elsewhere, this is, well, it's probably more than 4 standard deviations from the norm, if I can use Tom's line. And I think it's a very compelling argument for those who want to move and start action taking quickly, in particular if it's got an escalating rate. The second one is we already have administrative procedures to put tax in on fuels, so we can address, we can put a price in on oil and diesel and coal because we have relationships with these and we have a tax base. So we're not creating new bureaucracies or adding huge administrative costs to deal with it. So that was how we did it. Last year in summer of 2012, we'd had the carbon tax in place for 4 years. Quickly, we reached the last scheduled increase in July 1st, 2012. We also launched a carbon tax review. So the Minister of Finance had asked the public to submit comments on their thoughts on the carbon tax, all aspects of the carbon tax. And we released some early indicators of where we were at on the entire Climate Action Plan. And there's just a few, I won't delve into these because others have done deeper dives into them, but some of the very top line mentions of where we're at. And I'll caution you that this is not correlating these directly to the carbon tax. It's just talking about the BC's experience over 4 years when we had one. So the first one is BC's economy is relatively strong. This graph shows you a percentage change in GDP since 2007. And what you can see is how Canada has responded in the blue line, and that BC is very close or slightly better to that rate of change to Canada. It's important because when the carbon tax was implemented in 2008, it was largely implemented based on economic theory. And I think the concern was that this would create a risk that we'd have some shock to our economy as a result of instituting it. And we've seen, and the review's borne this out, no evidence of a harmful shock to BC's economy because of having a carbon tax. The second one is, and my x-axis is not very elegant here, but this shows you our emissions over time in BC from 2007 to 2012. Again, not just because of the carbon tax, because of a whole suite of measures, but we're actually doing fairly well to hit our first interim target in 2012. As of 2011, we are 5.8% below in terms of reduced emissions, and we're trying to get to 6% below by 2012. Lots of challenges in terms of making further progress, but again, in terms of assessing a carbon tax and a climate action plan, emissions are down. So GDP's up, emissions are down. We did notice that Canada, as well as other jurisdictions, had also seen declining emissions because of the economic downturn. And so what we were interested to see is, well, what does that really mean for fossil fuels? And this is a bit dated. Stuart has some better metrics, but this shows you between 2007 and 2011 the rate of change in major types of fossil fuels in BC. And you can see, if you look at the blue lines, Canada has also seen some downticks in fossil fuel use through the economic downturn. What's interesting is that they've largely rebounded. In BC, we've seen an absolute decline in all those types, and by a greater amount than the Canadian average. Again, cautious about correlation, but the simple message of something different is happening in BC. And the last one is we're spending less on fossil fuels in BC, and this is probably the hardest thing to measure in a reliable way, but as for illustration, we're actually getting more in terms of new economic opportunities from, in the green economy. One is British Columbians have an adoption rate on hybrid vehicles that's over twice the Canadian national average, and we're looking to be getting pretty close to that on electric vehicles now as well. Our clean tech sector, largely on their own merits of innovation and entrepreneurship, but they've grown by 48% in terms of their sales during that period. We have the most active district energy market in Canada. 20% of all LEED Gold buildings, that's a green design specification. 20% of all new LEED Gold buildings in Canada since 2007 are here in BC. We have a very strong green building and architecture sector. We've delivered 785,000 tons of what are called offsets in BC. We're one of the largest purchasers of offsets in North America and one of the most ready offset markets in North America for some of the new carbon markets that are developing. And right down to the personal level, we have a program called Live Smart where British Columbians can insulate their homes and receive incentives. 10% of all eligible homes in BC they've paid their own money to get their houses audited, made investments to reduce their emissions, and saved money from reduced energy costs. Also, we've got 8,400 small businesses have gone through the same thing. So the new economy transition has been arguably more striking than the message of reduced emissions in BC. In February of this year, the government had issued its budget, which looked at the competitiveness of the carbon tax, as well as principles like revenue neutrality. They'd received over 2,000 submissions from individuals and businesses and other stakeholders. And I would say, too, for academics or other people in other jurisdictions, this is delivered by the Minister of Finance. So this is not a minister responsible for climate change perspective. This is a minister responsible for budgets and good tax policy in British Columbia. And a couple interesting findings. At current rates, does not appear to have a significant impact on BC's overall economic performance. So again, to look at the concerns in 2008 to where we've ended up in 2013, that's a pretty dramatic change in perspective in terms of BC's experience. The carbon tax is maintained at $30 a ton. That means we have by far the most comprehensive and highest price on carbon in North America and one of the leading prices in the world. There has been what's commonly called a freeze. The decision is that the carbon tax will not be increased or broadened for a period of time. And the challenge is really to look to see other jurisdictions adopting levels of similar effort and to try to promote those. We've, as an aside, testified in front of legislative committees in Oregon. We've done work in the state of Washington and other jurisdictions, and are seeing some interest now in these results and further adoption of the policy. Interesting of note, too, is there's been lots of debates around spending carbon tax revenues on programs. And again, in the budget, the revenue neutrality, this tax recycling mechanism, has been viewed as the best way to protect overall economic growth and reduce emissions. There is, down to the exemptions, there is one area around the agricultural sector which was of particular concern in the budget and announcements. One was a grant program for greenhouse growers as a bit of a unique situation in BC. And secondly, signaling an intention to exempt what are called colored fuels. So these are, there's currently an exemption on all fuel taxes related to the agricultural sector, and an expansion of that to be consistent with that process to the carbon tax. But barring those two areas, the carbon tax has been reviewed and maintained in all aspects. I just wanted to end a little bit, I started with why would we take a leadership position on climate change, and wanted to end a little bit with an epilogue around what's the big intention behind this. And one of the things I think that's always difficult for any jurisdiction to take action is the solution to global warming is a lot of people taking action in a lot of jurisdictions, but no one jurisdiction can solve the problem on their own. And so there's an inherent public policy challenge that we all struggle with. To get it out of carbon taxes, a side story was California had adopted vehicle tailpipe standards, the California tailpipe standards. And at the time faced a lot of the same criticisms. You're going to raise costs to consumers, you're going to create economic fragmentation, you're going to hurt the competitiveness of the auto industry. But the state of California thought this was innovative, they thought it was reasonable, and they felt it was important to take action. BC was the first Canadian jurisdiction to support the California tailpipe standard. Through work with the other states and provinces, we hit a point where these Western Climate Initiative members, 79% of Canadian GDP had agreed to move on these tougher vehicle standards. When President Obama was elected in the US, it was a relatively easy effort for him to nationalize those standards across the US. If you look at the history of US regulatory development, it was an immediate process to take a regional standard and to nationalize it. And Canada did it within days of the US because, again, the argument had flipped to the 21% who hadn't moved. Now, when we're looking at the updated versions, they're actually being done federally. That this issue of subnational innovation and implementation and then broader adoption, we're fast tracking past that. And our ultimate goal on a carbon tax is not to have this intellectually pure mechanism here in BC, it's to have that and to encourage the adoption at a broader level as an effective means to deal with climate change. So that's in a nutshell.
Thank you very much. So we're going to go on now. Professor Stuart Elgee from the University of Ottawa is going to bring you up to date on the latest data. Stuart.
Hi. As an ex-British Columbian now exiled in Ottawa, I feel like the weather gods throw days at us like this one today when we come back out just to taunt us. I don't know what you guys are doing in here. I would be out enjoying one of those statistically anomalous climate change-induced days if we're not up here speaking to you. But since you guys have chosen foolishly to be in here listening to climate change instead of experiencing it, here we go. James covered some of the stuff I'm going to cover, so I'll try and be a little bit quicker. We're not the well-oiled machine you might think. Let me talk a little bit just quickly about Sustainable Prosperity, who was behind this report I'm going to talk about. It's somewhat like PICS in the sense that we're a national environment economy research network, brings together academics across the country working at the interface of environment and economy, not just economists, but political scientists, lawyers, some scientists as well. And the idea is to try to not just generate good knowledge, but to actually move that from research into the policy debate. So we've actually got CEOs of companies, heads of think tanks, NGO leaders that are also part of the network to keep the academics honest about not getting too lost in the world of jargon that we sometimes tend to do. And so there you go. We do a whole bunch of stuff, some of which I'm going to talk about today, but mainly trying to generate research in a bunch of areas, particularly on how we actually harness market forces to move towards a sustainable environment and economy, not just the traditional tools we usually use. We try to actually connect the researchers to the policymakers and have like Occam Steiner, the head of the United Nations Environment Program, so that we actually get the idea generators talking with the people who have to use that knowledge and ultimately to try to actually change policy. So BC's carbon tax for me is really fascinating as a scholar because it's the kind of thing that academics have been saying for years we should do, and very rarely do politicians do exactly what academics tell them they should do, probably for good reason, frankly. So it'd be interesting to see how it works. That's one of the reasons I've been interested in studying this. I have to look because this screen here gives me two different slides and I still haven't figured out pattern recognition well enough to know which of the two you're looking at. So now I think I've got it though. So James has gone over all this stuff, carbon tax, 4 years, $30 a ton, tax shift. Interestingly, this guy Paul Ekins, who was the chair of the United Kingdom's Green Fiscal Commission and probably the most respected environmental taxation scholar in the world, we brought him out here a few years ago and he called BC's carbon tax the best designed carbon tax in the world, which is high praise. So, how's it working? I'm going to focus particularly on the question of environmentally how's it working, but also say a little bit quickly about economically and politically. I'm going to talk about a research paper that we put out as a report last year and is about to come out published in Canadian Public Policy in the coming weeks. Essentially, we're trying to look at how BC's use of fossil fuels has changed since the carbon tax came in. We focus primarily on the fuels rather than on greenhouse gases more generally, partly because the data for greenhouse gases lags for 1 or 2 years. It's about a year or two behind fuel use data just for reasons of data gathering. There's not advanced economic methodologies in here, so it's more just simple Stats Canada data. What we've really tried to do as much as we can is to try to isolate down to figure out which effects have been driven by the carbon tax as opposed to the many other forces in society that affect our fuel use. And I'm going to talk a little bit about research of one of my colleagues that actually has done some serious econometric analysis on at least one type of fuel use in BC to try to really distill out the effects of the carbon tax. So, overall fuel use, since the carbon tax came in, what you see here is BC's fuel use, and this is only focusing on those fuels that are subject to the carbon tax. I'll come back in a minute. James talked about it being about 70% of greenhouse gases. I'll come back in a minute and break those out for you. But of those fuels, fuel use is down 15% at the time of these data, 3.5 years. That's a really significant drop. What's probably more significant, though, because people will say things like, well, the economy was in a downturn for part of that, is we compared that to what was happening in the rest of Canada. Because I can tell you from Ontario, we had a recession too. So to compare apples to apples, you'd say, how did BC do compared to the rest of Canada that went through a similar economic cycle? Well, 16.4%. That's a big number. I mean, a really, really big number in terms of change of fuel use in a 3.5-year period. Now, I'm not going to say, as an academic, I can say all that happened because of the carbon tax, but let's start peeling back the layers of the onion to see how much we can do to try to get a better sense of that. I can tell you, by the way, that the data that's about to come out in the new article shows that trend continued in 2012. So I can't give you the numbers yet because the publisher would kill me. But that trend will continue when the 2012 data is published in a few weeks, and the number will be bigger. Interestingly, the new 2011 data on greenhouse gases just came out. So the lag is only 1 year right now. It's actually in one of those good periods when they're only a year behind the fuel use data. And what you see is, again, focusing just on those greenhouse gases that are subject to the carbon tax, BC's GHGs are down about 10% since 2008, whereas the rest of Canada are down about 1% over that period. So about a 9% advantage in terms of reducing greenhouse gases since the carbon tax came in. A little bit different from the 16% figure. Why might that be? Well, a couple of reasons. One is, if you look in 2008, you'll see that BC actually lagged behind Canada by 2%, but the carbon tax didn't come in until July 1st of that year. And so the greenhouse gas data are annual, they cover the whole year, so it's probably, my guess is it's picking up a bunch of stuff that happened in the first 6 months of 2008 before the carbon tax was having an effect on behavior. So if you look at the rest of the time, BC's been outperforming Canada since the carbon tax came in. Also, as James said, there are some types of greenhouse gases that are not related to fuel use. And so GHGs are going to show a little bit different pattern than fuel. But the main story is the same story. BC well ahead of Canada in terms of greenhouse gas efficiency since the carbon tax came in. All right, so let's ask another good question. Oftentimes, when I first put this report out, a bunch of people, including the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, said, well, this is happening mainly because people are crossing over the border to buy their gas in the U.S. The idea of someone driving from Kamloops or Prince George to get their gas in the U.S. to save 3 cents a liter seemed a little absurd to me, but arguably someone living down in White Rock might do it. Fair enough. There probably are no doubt people doing that. They were doing it before the carbon tax too, but there probably are some people doing that. So break out all the types of fuel that are subject to the carbon tax, and you look here and you see a bunch of them, right? Propane, motor gasoline, diesel, fuel, asphalt, quote-unquote lube oil. All of those down by a minimum of 7% in British Columbia compared to the rest of Canada. So no one simplistic explanation about, well, it's just drivers in the Lower Mainland, it's just people, switching over to different types of heating. No one explanation can actually explain it. It cuts across all fuel use. And here's what's really interesting. You see aviation up there. If you look carefully, you'll see that's not like the others, right? BC has lagged behind the rest of Canada in aviation. Aviation is the one fuel that's largely exempt from the carbon tax. Any flights outside the province, which are most fuel use for flights in BC, are exempt from the carbon tax. And so again, this just reinforces the idea that it's the carbon tax that's having a major role in driving this, because the one fuel type that is mainly exempt from it, we didn't actually see BC come out ahead. In fact, it lagged a little behind the rest of the country. What about the issue of, well, people say, well, yeah, but BC was already outperforming the rest of Canada before 2008. So you're just picking up the fact that you guys are a bunch of environmentally enlightened, Prius-driving, latte-sipping West Coast environmentalists. This has nothing to do with the carbon tax. Now, all that may be true, but it doesn't mean that the carbon tax didn't have an effect on how you got to your cafe to have your latte, I suppose. So if you look at the period from 2000 to 2008, you will see that indeed, British Columbians were more fuel efficient than the rest of Canada, but their pattern trended pretty much very close to the rest of Canada. They weren't, that gap hadn't widened much in the previous 8 years, whereas once the carbon tax comes in, the gap widens dramatically. Changes from about 0% change a year to 5% a year change after the carbon tax. So again, something happened on July 1st, 2008, that began to initiate a very significant change in behavior. And I've yet to hear anyone come up with a credible candidate other than the carbon tax for explaining that, but I'm all ears. Now, is this shocking? No, not to an economist. To put it in simple language, when you charge more for something, people use less of it. That's not rocket science, that's not revolutionary. That's what pretty much all of modern economics is based on. So when people like the Taxpayers Federation say fuel use has gone up in BC since the carbon tax, they are basically defying all economic theory since Adam Smith, suggesting that when you charge more for something, people tend to buy more of it, which would be bizarre, frankly, if that were the case. So this is a summary in 2004 by Thomas Stern, an economist in Sweden, who looked at the relationship between taxes on fuel and fuel use across the world, and you see a perfect curve, that the higher the tax rate, the less the fuel use. Not a big surprise, and a very significant relationship too. What's circled down there are Australia, US, and Canada, 3 of which have had among the lowest fuel taxes in all of the OECD, and which have 3 of the highest fuel use rates in all of the OECD. By the way, I could show you a very similar curve for water use. When you charge more for something, people use less of it. That's essentially the intuition behind all this stuff, and it ought not to shock you, but it does seem to be politically shocking that this happens. Here's something that is kind of interesting, though, even to the academic geeks in the room, is this is research that's about to be published by a colleague of mine, Nick Rivers and Brandon Scheifele. What they've looked at, and they've done some sophisticated econometric analysis that if you ask me to explain, you will tap the depths of my ignorance, but it has a lot of equations, to try to really isolate the effects on motor vehicle use since the carbon tax. And what they found is the change in use from the carbon tax is about 5 times greater than the change from just a change in price of fuel alone. So an equivalent change in price from a tax to a change in fuel has induced a 5-time greater behavioral change, which is really interesting. Now, economists have found this from taxes before, but not quite that big a difference. Now, we can't explain fully why. That would be a really interesting behavioral economics question. Any of you graduate students looking to do behavioral economics, this would be a really cool question to drill down into. But I'll give you a few of the theories they put out. One of them is obvious, and this one seems to make intuitive sense, that because BC phased it in over a 5-year period, people had an expectation that there would be a constant rise in the price of fuel over that time, as opposed to prices of fuel, which we figure will bounce around up and down, and we're not about to go out and change our behavior based on something we think is going to come back down in a few months. Whereas the carbon tax, we expected a trend, and so people making long-term purchase decisions for a car or a heating system for their home would likely say, okay, I think I'm going to get my money back because this thing's going to continue. Second thing is what's sometimes called the announcement effect, but this has continued beyond the announcement, so let's call it the awareness effect. There has been way more media and awareness of this carbon tax than there would be of daily changes in fuel price. So in terms of the psychology of pricing, there's a much, I can tell you, Ontario, this is something McGuinty never wanted known, but when they brought in the HST and applied it to fuels, they actually had as big a hidden carbon tax as BC has, but a little bit bigger depending on the price, because they added the 8% provincial sales tax to fuel. But I'll bet you, we haven't researched it yet, it hasn't had the same effect on behavior as BC's has, partly because people didn't know it. And so it hasn't had the same sort of psychological effect on our behavior. So price is a complex thing, how it affects our behavior. The final thing which they hypothesize, which is interesting, is sort of this reverse free rider. So a free rider effect, you guys probably know, right? That there's no point in me doing something when no one else. So if we're in a society where no one paid taxes, I would be stupid to pay taxes because I wouldn't get all the benefits and I'd be paying the costs. Similarly, if I could get away with it, it's in my interest not to pay taxes because I'm still going to get to drive on the highways, have a police force, and all those things. So the idea here is that people are less likely to do some of the kind of noble sacrificial things that we can personally do to reduce our fuel use if they don't think most other people are going to use it because they don't feel like it's going to make a big difference. Some of us do it anyway, and I'm one of them just because it kind of makes us feel better. But a lot of people, if they thought everyone else was going to do it, they'd be more likely to do it. And that's part of their hypothesis, is that this carbon tax makes you assume that your neighbors are going to have to make changes to their fuel efficiency, and so it reinforces what you'd like to do morally anyways. Our economic and our moral signals are pointed in the same direction rather than in the opposite direction, like when you stand there at the organic broccoli thinking, am I really going to pay twice as much for organic broccoli? Is that really going to save the world? You know, that angst-ridden environmentalist moment that you guys probably don't have. So anyway, this is a really interesting study looking at breaking out how it's affected our behavior. GDP, James talked about that, but yeah, BC's GDP has slightly outperformed the rest of Canada over that time period. So as a whole, you cannot say it's had a negative effect on the economy. Now, it'd be interesting to drill down into particular sectors. For example, Brandon's trying to look at the effects on agriculture, and what he's finding are very, very small effects, if any, in terms of agriculture, but we don't have reliable enough data that I would hang my hat on any of that yet. What is interesting, though, you can look at places that have had longer experience and have done, this is the most in-depth study of tax shifting I'm aware of ever in the world. So it was a team of economists from Europe looked at the experience in 6 different European countries that had brought in carbon tax shifts over a period of 15 or more years. They looked at both the effects on greenhouse gases and GDP. And they used Cambridge University with a sophisticated economic model that the EU uses to make a lot of budgetary decisions. So again, not surprisingly, the graph on the left shows effect on GHG emissions. They went down. Didn't go down as much as BC's, but partly, I won't get into the details, most of those carbon taxes are not as well designed as BC's. For example, most of them exempt to a greater or lesser degree major industries. So BC's has had a little bit more effect than those, which is not surprising. But the interesting one is the one on the right, the effect on GDP. And you see over a period of time, all of those countries had anywhere from a neutral to a slightly positive effect on GDP. And that's over a long enough time. You see a little bit of noise in the first few years, and that often happens in an economic transition after you introduce a new price shock. But once that initial bouncing around changes, you see a consistent trend of steady or even slight GDP growth, and that's just isolating the effects of a carbon tax, this study. This isn't looking at overall GDP in those countries. This is looking at isolating the effect of the carbon tax shift. And I emphasize the shift because they also ran this model looking at what would happen if you hadn't put those carbon tax revenues back into income tax cuts. If you just had it as a straight carbon tax, and they find a slight GDP decline in every one of those cases. So it's the shifting of taxes. It's shifting to increase taxes on pollution and lower taxes on income and investment that's resulted in that having a slightly positive performance. Now this is not earth-shattering positive economic news. It's, let's just say for rounding errors, it's more or less neutral, slightly positive. But the point is, they've achieved very significant environmental outcomes without hurting the economy. And that's the same story I would say for BC. Wouldn't pretend that you'd say this has been an economic bonanza. Over time, as James says, we may be able to see there's been a shift in kind of building a more sustainable, low-carbon economy. And if the world moves in that direction, that may well be good news for BC. But we don't know that yet. But even if you can achieve the gains that we've seen here without economic harm, boy, that's a policy home run. And it's the same story we've seen in the European countries that have been doing this for longer, albeit with a less well-designed carbon tax in each case. And of course, the familiar story is that this has, in the end, not been even revenue neutral. It's been revenue negative, or taxpayer positive, if you want to put it another way. Something Christy Clark may not be entirely happy about at the moment. But taxpayers have come out ahead over $500 million so far because of this tax shift. So this is actually something the BC Taxpayers Federation ought to be standing up and cheering about. This has actually been one of the most tax-positive measures for the average taxpayer in Canada that we've seen any government bring in. Now, BC has both the lowest corporate and personal income tax, incomes below $120,000 in the country. The last budget, I understand, has increased the corporate tax rate by 1%, so you could say one of the lowest corporate tax rates, but all of that because of the carbon tax. I won't say too much about the politics, because Katerina's going to say a little bit more about it, but just to flag that when I did a CBC interview this morning, you often hear people say this. This has been highly controversial, and there's been a lot of opposition. And I have to call people on that, because I've been tracking the polling data on this stuff, and other than a few outliers, the polling data has never dipped much below about 50% public support for this stuff. And the latest poll I saw was 64% support by Environics, late December of last year. Now, these things bounce around a little bit, but that's a really significant number. What other tax in BC has a 64% level of public support? Certainly not the HST. For that, you don't get those kind of support numbers for a tax. So it actually is a really interesting story, right? The NDP fought the previous election on access to tax, and it didn't have any negative effect on the government. In Ottawa, where I come from, and people don't often see across the Rocky Mountains, they tend to associate any word carbon tax with Stéphane Dion, who never, of course, brought a carbon tax in. He just talked about one, and they don't actually think about what happened in the place that actually brought one in. And so the conventional wisdom in Eastern Canada or Central Canada is that this stuff is political suicide. Well, you just have to look across the Rockies to where it actually happened to see that it doesn't have to be political suicide. And there's a bunch of things that were done differently in BC, which then we won't talk about in depth, but obviously timing matters, being a good communicator matters. Dion had a really complex tax shift that was trying to address all kinds of social programs through the shift too, and I think it just kind of confused people. But the other thing is, Campbell just did it, right? He didn't have a major electoral debate about it. He just, as James said, had a few months of consultation and said, we're doing this. And one of the things, this is a pet theory of mine, but I'd be interested to have somebody look at it. I actually think it's easier for a right-of-center government to bring in this kind of policy because they're guarded on their economic flank. It's a lot harder. If you look at the three governments in Canada that have carbon pricing, Charest was right-of-center in Quebec politics. Alberta has a cap-and-trade scheme, again, brought in by a Conservative party in BC. So all three are right-of-center governments. And I think it actually is politically easier for them to do it. Sort of a only Nixon could go to China kind of thing. So ironically, Stephen Harper is well positioned to bring in a carbon tax. Now, he may not necessarily seize that opportunity, but the opportunity is there. I'll just skip through this because we're over time. But basically the point here is Canada and the US are way behind the rest of the OECD in the use of environmental taxes generally. These are a much more common policy tool in most of the OECD, and it hurts us economically we don't do it. The OECD in its country reports consistently reports on that it hurts Canada economically to not be using these market-based instruments. Why does it matter? Well, we've talked about one reason. Tom said, carbon tax is the best way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And at the risk of contradicting my host, I don't agree. The best way to reduce them would just be to say you must reduce greenhouse gas emissions or you must shut down all coal power plants. But those would be economically disastrous. So, and I know he knows this too, I'm just using him as a foil. Carbon taxes are good because they're the most cost-effective way. The reason we don't reduce greenhouse gas emissions isn't because we wake up in the morning saying, gee, I'd like to pollute the atmosphere. Maybe some of you guys do, but I've yet to meet anyone who woke up thinking, boy, I'd love to screw up the planet today. we wake up in the morning thinking we'd like to balance our budget, go to work, make life, and so the obstacle to doing these things is the cost. It's not that we don't want to do them, it's just we think we can't afford them. And so if you can address the cost barrier, you've addressed almost the entire barrier to dealing with these policies. And this is the advantage of carbon taxes, is they allow us to achieve these environmental outcomes in a way that's dramatically more cost effective than almost all the other policy tools available to us. And the other second advantage is they drive innovation. So if you can think of it really simply, if someone said all companies must bring in the same type of technology to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or for fuel efficiency, they would all become more efficient. But there'd be no innovation going on, right? They'd all be told to kind of take the same change. Whereas a carbon tax or a price actually rewards companies who go further and further and further in reducing their emissions, and individuals too, by the way. So the way we've dealt with pollution for the last 30 or 40 years, we've just set the same standard for everyone. It's like a speed limit approach. Hit this speed limit and you're fine. No incentive to go any lower, just hit the limit. A tax approach, as a company, you make more and more and more money the more efficient you get. And that's the language that works for companies. And so this is an OECD report talking about how experiences with how green tax shifting drives innovation. And so that's the second reason why these are actually a much better instrument to use than the approach that the federal government's been talking about using. Let's get tough on polluters by making all of them have a tough greenhouse gas standard. Well, that's good rhetoric, but it actually is not going to induce the same kind of innovation. It's not going to induce the same kind of cost effectiveness, which is why you see oil company CEOs saying, carbon tax me. They would rather have that approach. Anyway, I'm going to wrap up. We'll leave questions about what BC should do next, perhaps to the question and answer session. Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
So there you have it. A climate policy made in heaven. I think that was the words you used, or something along that line. No, climate policy home run was what it was. Well, what we're going